I got the job with MrBeast. It still feels surreal saying that. This wasn't just a YouTube job, this was the YouTube job. I couldn't believe my luck. The guy whose face was everywhere, giving away millions of dollars, cars, entire houses, he'd noticed me. He had a staff of at least 100, and yet somehow I'd been chosen to be part of that team. And let's be real, working with MrBeast wasn't just a job. It was a one-way ticket to YouTube stardom. On my first day, I felt that familiar anxiety, the imposter syndrome gnawing at me, whispering that I was about to be found out. But the staff seemed different. I thought they'd be happy, upbeat, like in all the behind-the-scenes videos MrBeast sometimes posted. But there was something about the way they all kept their heads down. Not unhappy exactly, but watchful, like they were waiting for something. "Congratulations on joining the team." Jake, a senior producer, clapped me on the shoulder in the hallway as we passed. His smile was friendly, but his eyes kept darting to the shadows of the room, as if he was always looking over his shoulder. "Just, a few quick things to remember around here." I nodded, trying to keep my grin plastered on to look confident and comfortable. "Yeah, of course. First rule," he said, counting on his fingers, "never stay in the office after dark. When the filming wraps, just get out immediately." I frowned, chuckling nervously. "That's pretty strict." "We run a tight ship," he grinned, but his smile was tight, forced. "Rule 2, when Jimmy, MrBeast, has an off day, you have an off day too. Just don't ask questions about it." Something prickled up my spine, but I shrugged it off. Maybe it was his way of easing me into the quirks of a high-stakes environment. "Got it?" I nodded, even as my brain whirled with questions. "Anything else?" "One more thing," he said, hesitating. "Sometimes when we're filming, don't look him directly in the eyes. Just trust me on that one." His words were half-whispered, as if he feared someone might overhear. My skin crawled. But before I could press him, he'd walked off down the hall, leaving me to mull over his cryptic rules. It was almost too good to be true, working on the creative team, helping come up with the kind of stunts that went viral overnight. And I mean, MrBeast was paying well. Like, obscenely well for someone at my level. That's probably what got me to ignore the strangeness at first. I figured these people were all paranoid, working under high pressure, chasing that impossible next hit. Maybe Jake and the others were just stressed. That first week everything went smoothly. Jimmy, MrBeast, as I kept calling him in my head, was a professional, but something about him was off. In person, he seemed larger than life in a way that even his biggest videos couldn't capture. His gaze was intense, like he could see through you, but I brushed it off as charisma. That's what I wanted to believe. By Friday night, we were prepping for one of his biggest events yet, a last-person standing challenge with hundreds of fans competing for a huge cash prize. I'd been running on adrenaline all week, and somehow, without realizing it, I was the last one left in the building, tidying up. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the empty set. I glanced at the clock and remembered Jake's first rule: never stay in the office after dark. I laughed a little, scolding myself for even caring. This is real life, I thought. It's not a horror movie. But as I turned off the lights and moved toward the exit, a sound stopped me. It was low at first, just a faint growling hum that sent shivers along my spine. I told myself it was a generator kicking in, a vent, something logical, but the noise grew louder, shifting into something that felt alive. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I felt drawn against my better judgment back toward the set. The shadows seemed deeper than before, pooling and twisting in unnatural shapes. And then I saw him. He was crouched, back to me, in the center of the set. His head was tilted, his body tense and coiled like an animal about to pounce. I couldn't make sense of it. Why would Jimmy, MrBeast, be sitting alone in the dark like this? He didn't move, just breathed. But it wasn't normal breathing. His chest expanded and contracted like something that was too large for his frame, something that didn't belong there. And his hands, God, his hands, were larger, fingers stretching out like claws, pale and grey under the weak light. I tried to step back, but my foot hit something, a loose can maybe, and the clatter echoed in the silence. He froze. My heart was a jackhammer in my chest as he turned his head, slowly, unnaturally. His face was barely human. His eyes, were those even eyes? They were dark, bottomless, more like pits than anything I'd seen on a human being. And his mouth, it twisted up in a sick, hungry smile, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too long. "You shouldn't be here." His voice was layered, guttural, almost like two voices speaking at once. One Jimmy, the cheerful, friendly guy from YouTube, and the other something ancient and sinister, a whisper of pure malice. I didn't wait to hear more. I stumbled backward, slamming into a row of chairs, nearly falling as I scrambled toward the door. His laughter followed me, low and rumbling, almost mocking. My hands shook as I fumbled with the door, finally wrenching it open and bolting into the hallway. I ran, not stopping until I was in my car, gasping for breath, my mind reeling. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I remembered what Jake had said. When the filming wraps, just get out immediately. The next day when I came in, everything was normal. The set was clean, pristine, as if nothing had happened. Jake greeted me with a knowing nod, his eyes narrowed as if to say, "Now you understand." And I did. But I stayed anyway. Because what I'd seen, whatever it was, it had also seen me. I'd convinced myself that it was some kind of hallucination, that I was stressed, sleep-deprived. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe some twisted prank. After all, what other explanation was there? A creature lurking within the world's most popular YouTuber? It was insane. Still, the memory gnawed at me, and I found myself glancing around corners, flinching at every little sound. The staff noticed my nervousness, but never said a word. In fact, the others seemed eerily calm, and they all acted like nothing was out of the ordinary. The whole place felt like a dream, the kind where everything seemed just a little too quiet, a little too perfect. A few weeks later, the email came through. MrBeast was planning another big fan event, an overnight survival challenge with a huge cash prize. Hundreds of contestants would spend the night in a haunted forest, competing in physical and mental challenges until only one was left standing. It sounded straightforward enough, except for one odd detail. Jimmy insisted on holding the event during the full moon. That was when the gnawing fear resurfaced. Full moon. The words echoed in my mind, conjuring up memories of him crouched on the set, that monstrous, twisted form hidden in the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that the timing was no coincidence. The night of the event arrived. The crew set up camp on the edge of the forest with tents, equipment, and enough generators to keep the place lit up like a carnival. As night fell, fans poured into the event grounds, laughing, filming themselves, buzzing with excitement for the chance to be featured in a MrBeast video. I scanned the faces in the crowd, young and hopeful, each one a die-hard fan who would do anything to be part of the show. A few of them recognized me, waving and calling my name. Their enthusiasm was infectious, almost enough to calm my nerves. Almost. Jimmy arrived just as the moon rose, a silvery disk in the night sky, casting an eerie glow over the trees. He was in full showman mode, laughing, joking, rallying the crowd. He looked like the MrBeast everyone knew, the kind, goofy guy who loved making people happy. But up close, something was different. His skin looked paler, almost ashen, and his eyes had a strange, hungry gleam. I found myself staring, trying to catch a glimpse of the thing I'd seen before, but he only smiled at me, that same unsettling smile from the other night. "You're in for a real treat tonight," he said, his voice soft, just for me. "Make sure you capture every moment." His words lingered in my mind long after he'd walked away. As the challenges began, I was assigned to film the contestants as they navigated the woods, completing tasks designed to test their endurance. The night was alive with laughter, shouts, and the occasional scream as contestants stumbled over obstacles or spooked each other. It was almost easy to forget my paranoia, almost. But then, sometime around midnight, everything changed. It started as a low growl, deep and rumbling, echoing from somewhere deep within the forest. I stopped, holding my breath, convinced I'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, a sound so guttural and primal that it made my skin crawl. I glanced at the other crew members, but they kept filming, their faces expressionless, as if they hadn't heard a thing. My radio crackled and Jake's voice came through, strained and barely audible. "All crew, clear the woods, now!" I hesitated, looking around at the unsuspecting fans and contestants. They had no idea, laughing and filming themselves, oblivious to the danger lurking in the shadows. But before I could say anything, Jimmy appeared in the clearing, his face barely visible in the moonlight. His eyes glowed, reflecting the light like an animal's, and his smile, it was wide, too wide, stretching across his face like something that didn't quite belong there. "Everyone's doing great!" he called out, his voice louder, deeper than before. "Keep going! The real challenge is about to begin." I watched in horror as he began to change, right there in front of everyone. His body seemed to ripple, his skin shifting and stretching, his limbs elongating, his fingers lengthened, claws tearing through the skin at the tips, his jaw widening to reveal rows of sharp, uneven teeth. His face twisted, eyes sinking into dark hollows, a monstrous, nightmarish visage forming in place of the man I once thought I knew. The contestants finally noticed, their laughter fading into horrified silence. One by one they began to back away, their phones still recording, hands shaking, but he didn't let them go. With a speed that defied reason, he lunged forward, grabbing the nearest contestant. The girl screamed, but it was cut short as his mouth opened wide, far wider than any human mouth could, and he bit down, sinking those terrible teeth into her shoulder. Blood sprayed across the clearing and the crowd erupted into chaos. People ran, screaming, phones clattering to the ground as they abandoned any hope of capturing the nightmare unfolding before them. I wanted to look away, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot as Jimmy, MrBeast, ripped into the girl, feeding on her in full view of the cameras. The rest of the crew barely reacted, moving mechanically, almost like they were in a trance. Jake grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Don't look," he hissed, his face pale. "He's feeding. We need to clear out." "Feeding?" I choked out, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer, just kept pulling me toward the edge of the woods, away from the screams and the chaos. I glanced back one last time, just in time to see MrBeast turn, his face slick with blood, his dark eyes meeting mine with that same twisted smile. We didn't return to the woods that night. The crew gathered in a makeshift tent on the edge of the forest, whispering in hushed voices as we waited for the screams to die down. Eventually the forest fell silent, the only sounds the faint rustle of leaves and the distant howl of some unseen creature. I looked around at the others, expecting horror, panic, anything. But they were calm, almost resigned, as if this was just another day on the job. What was that?" I finally asked, my voice shaking. Jake looked at me, his face unreadable. "You wanted to work for MrBeast," he said, his tone cold. "Now you know why they call him that." He didn't offer any more explanation, and I was too shaken to press further. I sat there in silence, the reality of what I'd seen settling over me like a heavy fog. This wasn't the YouTube dream I'd signed up for. This was something else, something dark and ancient, something that lived just beneath the surface of the internet's most beloved persona. By dawn, The crew had cleaned up everything. The blood was gone, the bodies nowhere to be found, and the footage erased. Just like that, it was as if nothing had happened. The world would go on, blissfully unaware of the monster hiding in plain sight. But I knew. And as I watched the sun rise, a sickening realization washed over me. I was trapped, because I'd seen too much and now there was no way out. The day after the full moon, MrBeast's crew was back in the office, just as if nothing had happened. I walked through the door, half expecting to see bloodstains or missing faces among the staff, but everything was painfully normal. Jake was there, looking dead tired but calm, chatting with the editors about footage from a recent video. Jimmy, or whatever it was nowhere to be seen, thank God. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it had all been some horrific misunderstanding, maybe a prank gone too far, but the screams, the blood, the look in Jimmy's eyes as he feasted, I knew it was real, and I knew that somehow everyone here was complicit in hiding it. A few days later, Jimmy summoned me to his office. The room was huge, modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the place in sunlight. It was a strange, almost calming contrast to the darkness I'd seen in the forest. He was back to his usual self, cheerful, charming, and completely human-looking. He greeted me with a big smile, like the whole thing had been a bad dream. "Hey, how's it going?" he asked, gesturing for me to sit down. I swallowed, my mouth dry, as I took a seat across from him. It's going well," I lied, forcing a smile. My mind raced, wondering if he knew that I'd seen him. If he remembered me, frozen in horror as he tore into one of his fans. "Good. Good to hear," he said, clasping his hands together. "So I wanted to talk to you about a special project." My stomach twisted. Special project?" He nodded, leaning forward, his eyes bright and eager, as if we were talking about any ordinary video. "I want to do something different. We'll call it a scavenger hunt. Something huge across the country. We'll invite fans from all over to participate, but..." He paused, his voice dropping a little, taking on that layered tone I'd heard before. "I'll need your help setting it up." I nodded, fighting the urge to look away. "Of course, anything you need." His smile widened, and for a brief, horrifying moment I saw the creature beneath. The thing that lurked behind that friendly facade. "Great! Here's what I need you to do." For the next few weeks, I worked on what was easily the most elaborate fan experience MrBeast had ever concocted. But this wasn't just a game or a challenge. It was a trap. Each location in the scavenger hunt was carefully chosen, hidden away in isolated places, abandoned buildings, deserted forests, places where there would be no one to hear screams or see the twisted things lurking in the shadows. As I pieced together the clues, I felt a sickening realization dawn on me. This wasn't about entertaining fans. This was about drawing them out, away from the safety of crowds and cameras, into places where he could feed without anyone noticing. Jimmy's team was disturbingly efficient. They had everything planned out, from setting up props to arranging rides and accommodations for the fans, all designed to ensure that once they reached each location, they were completely alone. One night, while setting up one of the hunt locations in a crumbling, abandoned house on the edge of town, Jake came to help me. We were the only ones in the building, and the eerie silence weighed on us like a shroud. "You know what this is, don't you?" I finally asked, unable to keep the question down any longer. Jake didn't look at me. Instead, he carefully arranged the props in the room, setting up a clue that would lead some poor soul to their doom. It's just how things are," he muttered after a long silence. "But why?" My voice shook. "Why are you all so okay with this?" He sighed, finally meeting my gaze. "Because we don't have a choice. None of us do. He pays us well, yeah, and he makes it worth it. But once you're part of the team, you're in for life. You saw what he is, right? I nodded, bile rising in my throat. Then you understand. You've seen it and he's seen you. That means there's no going back. You stay or you end up like them. He didn't need to say who they were, the unlucky fans, the disposable followers who would never make it back from this scavenger hunt. I felt sick. I wanted to scream, to run, to tell someone, anyone about the nightmare hidden behind MrBeast's smile. But Jake was right. I'd seen too much, and Jimmy's money, his influence, reached further than I could ever escape. Even if I managed to flee, he would find me, or he'd send someone else. The scavenger hunt launched to massive fanfare. The videos went viral instantly, fans sharing every clue, every step, hyped beyond belief that they could be part of something so big, so exclusive. They didn't know they were walking into a carefully planned nightmare. With each video, Jimmy's team watched as his fans ventured further into his territory, lured by promises of fame, fortune, and the chance to meet their hero. Each night, as I checked the live feeds and watched fans disappear into isolated locations, I felt my soul rot a little more. And each morning there would be new reports from the crew about contestants who had gone missing, fans who never made it back from the hunt. Then, one night, Jake pulled me aside. "It's tonight," he said, his face pale. "He's going to the next location to finish the hunt." My heart pounded. What does that mean?" Jake looked at me, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "It means he's going to feed, and we're going to be there to film it." I tried to protest, to tell him I couldn't do it, but he grabbed my arm, his grip tight, desperate. "If you don't show up, he'll come for you. It's the final rule. He doesn't let anyone walk away." That night, we arrived at the final scavenger hunt location, a remote, abandoned amusement park on the edge of town. The place was haunting in its emptiness, creaking rides looming in the darkness, shadows pooling beneath rusted roller coasters and broken-down carousels. The fans arrived, about a dozen of them, each one grinning and eager to be part of MrBeast's latest spectacle. Jimmy greeted them with open arms, laughing, joking, putting on the showman's facade that had drawn them here. But as the full moon rose above the trees, his expression shifted. That smile turned darker, wider, stretching across his face like a mask cracking open. His eyes glowed in the moonlight and his body began to change, his muscles rippling, his limbs elongating, skin twisting and contorting into something monstrous. The fans realized something was wrong, but it was too late. He lunged, his claws flashing in the moonlight as he grabbed the first victim, tearing into them with savage, unrestrained hunger. We filmed it all, every scream, every brutal, horrifying second. I wanted to turn away, but the other crew members watched, their faces expressionless, as if they'd seen it all before. And maybe they had. I stood there, paralyzed, as Jimmy feasted on his fans, devouring them one by one, the blood staining the ground, soaking into the cracked asphalt beneath our feet. When it was over, he stood there, his monstrous form covered in blood, his eyes gleaming as he looked at us. "Clean it up," he said, his voice that same horrible, layered tone, as if two voices were speaking at once. We worked in silence, scrubbing away the evidence, erasing the night's horrors as if they'd never happened. By dawn, the amusement park was spotless, the bodies gone, the blood wiped away. I looked at the other crew members, at Jake, and knew that they'd all made their choice long ago. They'd chosen to serve the beast, to feed him in exchange for money, power, and a place on his team. And now, I was one of them. The days following that night felt like sleepwalking. I was exhausted, my mind replaying the nightmare in the amusement park again and again. Each time I saw Jimmy, the creature, tearing into those fans, their screams ringing in my ears. But when I went into the office, it was as if none of it had happened. The crew carried on, editing new videos, setting up new challenges. Even Jake, who'd looked so broken that night, seemed back to his old self. Only I seemed to be crumbling. I'd catch myself shaking, zoning out during meetings, staring at Jimmy with the fear that I couldn't hide. But Jimmy noticed. "You're not looking so good, buddy." His voice was friendly, but there was something behind his eyes, something dark, as if he could see the terror beneath my skin. "Maybe you need a little time off." I tried to smile, to play it cool. "Yeah, maybe just a little break." He nodded, still watching me with that strange intensity. "Take a few days, get some rest, but don't go too far." His voice softened, the hint of a threat lingering. "We've still got a lot of work to do." I spent the next few days holed up in my apartment, barely eating or sleeping. My mind raced, flipping between fear and guilt. I'd stood there, filming while he slaughtered those fans. And even though I hadn't had a choice, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was as guilty as he was. But then a thought crept in, unbidden. What if I left? I could just go, disappear, escape before he found out. Surely he couldn't track me down if I was far enough away. I could start fresh, tell someone, warn people about what he really was. I was packing a bag, hands shaking as I threw clothes and essentials in, when I heard a knock on the door. I froze, heart pounding, as I crept over to the door and looked through the peephole. Jake stood outside, looking tired and drawn, glancing up and down the hallway as if he didn't want to be seen. I opened the door a crack. "What are you doing here?" He looked at me, his face tense. "You're leaving, aren't you?" I didn't answer, but I didn't have to. He sighed, glancing over his shoulder again before stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "You can't leave," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He'll find you. No matter where you go, he'll find you. And when he does..." His voice trailed off and I could see the fear in his eyes. "Jake, we can't keep doing this," I said, my voice shaking. "We can't just stand by while he eats people. There has to be a way out." He shook his head. "I've tried. Everyone here has tried, but he's got this hold on us. It's not just the money or the fame, it's something else. Something darker. We're bound to him. I don't know how to explain it, but we're stuck." "So what? We're just supposed to keep feeding him?" I felt a surge of anger, my fists clenching. "There has to be a way to stop him." Jake looked away, his shoulders slumping. "Maybe there is, but no one's lived long enough to find it." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of Jake's words pressing down on me. I thought about the fans, the ones who followed MrBeast with such devotion, never knowing the monster lurking behind his smile. And I thought about the crew, people like Jake who'd been lured in, trapped by something they couldn't escape. There had to be a way out. I just had to find it. The next morning, I was back at the office. Jimmy greeted me with his usual charm, flashing that perfect smile as if nothing had happened. I played along, forcing myself to laugh at his jokes, to pretend that everything was fine. But in my mind, I was planning. I needed to get close to him, to understand how he controlled us, how he held this power over everyone. If I could find his weakness, maybe I could break free. Over the next few weeks, I worked harder than ever, volunteering for every task, every late-night edit. I was always by Jimmy's side, watching, waiting for some clue, some hint of what he really was. And slowly, I began to notice things. For one, he never seemed to tire. While the rest of us crashed after long days of filming, he was always alert, always full of energy. And he had this way of looking at people, his eyes lingering just a little too long, as if he was sizing them up. One night, as we were wrapping up a shoot, I stayed behind, hoping to catch him alone. The rest of the crew had left, and it was just the two of us in the dimly lit studio. Jimmy was sitting in front of a mirror, wiping off makeup from the shoot when I saw it. In the reflection, his face flickered, just for a moment. His eyes glowed, a deep, hungry red, and his skin seemed to shift, something monstrous and grotesque beneath the surface. I took a step back, my heart racing. But he caught my reflection in the mirror and turned, his face shifting back to normal, his eyes cold and calculating. "Looking for something?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a warning. I forced a smile, my mind scrambling for an excuse. "No, I just wanted to say good night." He watched me for a moment, and I could feel his gaze piercing through me, as if he could see every thought, every fear. But then he smiled, his face relaxing. "Good night," he said, his voice warm again, friendly. "Get some rest. We've got a big shoot tomorrow." As I left the studio, I felt a new resolve hardening within me. I knew now that Jimmy wasn't just a monster. He was something far older, something that wore the mask of a man, but craved something darker. And I was going to find out what that was. I spent the next few days digging through the archives, combing through every scrap of information I could find on him. I went back to his earliest videos, looking for clues, anything that might give me an insight into what he really was. But there was nothing. It was as if he'd appeared out of nowhere, fully formed, his past a blank slate. Then, late one night, I found something. An old, obscure forum post, buried deep within the internet's forgotten corners. It was from a user who claimed to have worked with Jimmy in the early days before he'd become MrBeast. They described him as strange, charismatic, yes, but there was something off about him, something almost inhuman. They said he'd talked about feeding, about the energy he drew from his fans, how their adoration fueled him, made him stronger. The post ended with a chilling warning: "Stay away from him, he's not like us. He's something else, something that feeds on us, and if you're not careful, he'll feed on you too." I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. I knew now what I had to do. Jimmy wasn't just a monster, he was a predator. Something that thrived on attention, on adoration. And he'd built his entire empire to keep himself fed, to keep the beast within alive. But maybe, if I could turn that adoration against him, if I could expose him for what he really was. I logged on to the forum and started typing. I told my story, every detail, every horror I'd witnessed. I posted it anonymously, praying that someone would believe me, that the truth would spread. As I hit send, a feeling of dread settled over me. I knew he'd find out, and when he did, there would be nowhere for me to hide. But I didn't care anymore. I was done running, done hiding. Let him come. The backlash came quickly. Within hours of posting my story, the internet was buzzing with rumors, theories, and heated debates. I scrolled through the forums, seeing words like hoax, exposed, and even demonic conspiracy. Some users dismissed it as a prank or a disgruntled employee's fantasy. But others took it seriously. They speculated, searched for clues, dug up old videos and analysed every frame of Jimmy's work, looking for anything that might confirm the story. Then the videos started appearing, fans claiming to have seen something strange during his meetups, stories of people who disappeared after attending his events. The comments section on his latest uploads was flooded with questions and accusations. Is MrBeast hiding something? What happened to the fans who disappeared? Tell us the truth, Jimmy. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was fear. My heart raced each time I checked my phone, expecting a message or call from him. I'd heard nothing, but I knew it was only a matter of time. A few days later, I got an invitation. Not a text, not an email. An actual envelope slipped under my apartment door, addressed to me in Jimmy's unmistakable handwriting. Inside was a single slip of paper. Come to the studio tonight, alone. Let's settle this. My hands shook as I read the words. He knew it was me, and he wanted me to come to him. I considered running, leaving town and disappearing for good, but something inside me wouldn't let me. I'd started this, and now I had to see it through, no matter the cost. The studio was eerily empty when I arrived, the usual buzz of activity, the laughter of the crew, the hum of editing equipment. All of it was gone. The building was dark, shadows stretching across the walls as I made my way inside. He was waiting for me in the main filming room, sitting in a chair beneath a single overhead light. His face was calm, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth, but his eyes, they were cold, predatory, as if he were assessing me, measuring the weight of my fear. "You've caused quite a stir," he said, his voice low and almost amused. "I have to admit, I didn't think you'd go public." I swallowed, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "People deserve to know what you really are." He chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. "And what is that exactly?" I took a shaky breath, my hands clenching into fists. "You're a monster. You feed on people, on their attention, their adoration. And when that's not enough, you feed on them." He watched me in silence, his eyes glinting with something dark, something hungry. "You've done your homework," he said, almost admiringly, "but you've only scratched the surface." He stood, the light casting long shadows across his face, highlighting the inhuman sharpness of his features. "Do you know why I chose you? Why I brought you onto my team?" I shook my head, dread pooling in my stomach. "Because you have potential," he said, stepping closer, his voice soft but chilling. "You're ambitious. You want more than just a paycheck. You want to matter. And that's what I offer, a chance to be part of something bigger, something as eternal." I took a step back, my heart pounding. "I don't want any part of this," he sighed, as if disappointed. "That's a shame. I had high hopes for you." His expression darkened, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. "But I can't have you spreading lies. I built this empire on loyalty. My fans trust me. They worship me. And I won't let you tear that down." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone, tapping the screen a few times before holding it up to show me. It was a live stream, broadcasting right there in the studio, with thousands of fans already watching. "Say hi to the fans," he said, grinning. "Let's show them who the real monster is." My stomach dropped. He was going to frame me, turn his fans against me, make me look like the villain. And with his power, his influence, he could make it happen. No one would believe me, and I'd be branded as some lunatic who'd tried to ruin MrBeast. But then I remembered the videos, the fans who'd started to question him, the ones who'd seen the cracks in his facade. I took a deep breath, my mind racing, and stepped forward, forcing a smile. "I'll tell them the truth, Jimmy," I said, my voice steady. "I'll tell them everything." He watched me, amused, as I addressed the camera. "You want to know the truth about MrBeast?" I said, my voice steady, though my hands were shaking. "He's not who you think he is. He's not even human." I expected him to react, to lash out, but he just watched, a smirk on his face, as if daring me to go on. "Jimmy's a predator," I continued, my voice rising. "He feeds on your attention, your devotion. He's been building this empire not for you, but for himself. And when he's done with you, he'll devour you, just like he's done to countless fans who trusted him." The comments started flooding in, a mix of disbelief, horror, and anger. I saw messages like, "Is this real? Jimmy, is this true?" and "Who is this guy?" scrolling by in a blur. But then Jimmy laughed, a low, menacing sound that echoed through the empty studio. "You're not very bright, are you?" he said, shaking his head. "I don't need to explain myself. My fans, they'll believe anything I tell them. I've built this empire on loyalty, and that loyalty is absolute." He turned to the camera, his face shifting, the mask slipping just enough for his true form to show. His eyes glowed a deep, unnatural red, his teeth elongating into sharp, predatory fangs. "They call me MrBeast for a reason," he said, his voice layered with an eerie, inhuman resonance. "I'm exactly what they want me to be, and they love me for it." The comments exploded with disbelief and terror, fans begging for answers, others screaming that this had to be a prank. But it was too late. They'd seen the truth, even if only for a moment. Jimmy turned to me, his face still twisted in that monstrous grin. "You wanted to expose me. Well, congratulations, you did." He took a step closer, his form shifting, his skin rippling as he transformed, his body growing, twisting into the monstrous creature I'd seen that night in the forest. His claws extended, his eyes burning with an insatiable hunger. "But there's a price for disloyalty!" I stumbled back, my heart racing as the live stream continued, thousands of fans watching in horror as Jimmy stalked toward me, his monstrous form looming over me. I knew I couldn't escape, but maybe, just maybe, I could take him down with me. With a burst of adrenaline, I lunged forward, grabbing the camera and pointing it at him, making sure every viewer saw the horror that Jimmy had become. "This is your hero!" I shouted, my voice desperate. "This is the real MrBeast!" Jimmy roared, his claws slashing through the air as he lunged at me. I felt a searing pain as his claws tore into my side, but I held onto the camera, refusing to let go, refusing to let him hide. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the chat, thousands of fans finally seeing the truth, finally realizing the monster they'd been following all along. I woke up in a hospital bed, my body aching, bandages covering my wounds. I was alive, barely. But Jimmy, I didn't know what had happened to him. All I knew was that the live stream had gone viral, that people all over the world had seen the truth. There were news reports, investigations, fans demanding answers. But Jimmy's empire was vast, his influence stretching further than I'd ever imagined. Within days, his team had spun the story, claiming the video was a prank gone wrong, a stunt meant to entertain. They even had footage proving it, doctored clips showing Jimmy in a costume laughing, the creature nothing more than CGI. And his fans, most of them believed it. They wanted to believe it. They couldn't accept the truth, the reality that their hero was a monster. But some remembered what they'd seen. Some knew the truth. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I realized that Jimmy might have won this round, but his secret was out. There would always be those who questioned, those who doubted, those who remembered the horror that lay beneath his smile. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As always, thanks again for joining me tonight at Nightmare Theatre. I will see you all again tomorrow night.